He has tied himself to a standing stone, not because he wishes to die, but because he refuses to fall. The blood pours from his belly. The spear has gone through him. And still, his enemies cannot believe he is dead until a raven lands upon his shoulder. They draw near, they draw their blades, and in that final moment, his sword falls from his lifeless hand and severs the hand of the man who comes to claim victory. A hero's last act, defiance even beyond death. This is Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, and his story has echoed through centuries of Irish memory, written and rewritten, celebrated and contested, claimed and reclaimed by generations who sought in him something they needed to believe in. But who was he, really? And what did ancient people see in him that made them keep telling this tale night after night, century after century? You're listening to Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, where we follow the stories that shaped civilizations and ask, what do these myths reveal about the people who told them? I'm your host, and today we're exploring the legend of Cú Chulainn, one of the oldest and most violent hero tales in European literature. Born in Irish mythology's Ulster cycle, this demigod warrior became a symbol of defiance, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of glory. Over this episode, we'll trace this legend from its earliest written sources in the 12th century, explore the different versions that scribes recorded across manuscripts, and ask why this story, about a young man bound by curse and broken by prophecy, still matters today. We'll encounter variations that contradict each other, uncover common misconceptions about who Cú Chulainn really was, and discover how modern people have reshaped his image to serve their own struggles for identity and freedom. So, settle in, because the tale of Cú Chulainn is not a simple story of triumph. It's a story about what happens when prophecy and honor collide, and when a single warrior becomes a weapon that cannot be turned off. The earliest surviving record of Cú Chulainn comes to us from a manuscript held in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin. It is called Le Bor na Huidre, the Book of the Dun Cow. This vellum manuscript dates to the early 12th century and was written by at least 3 scribes working together. One of them, a monk named Mael Muir MacCailachire Mike Quinn Nambocht, was killed by raiders at his monastery in Clonmacnoise in 1106, a detail recorded in the Annals of the Four Masters, which gives us a latest possible date for the main body of the manuscript. The manuscript itself is incomplete. Pages are missing, the vellum is damaged and brittle with age, but inside it lies the oldest surviving version of the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the epic tale of the Cattle Raid of Cooley, the centerpiece of Cú Chulainn's legend. But here is the crucial point. These stories are far older than the manuscript itself. The language used in the oldest portions of the tales can be dated through linguistic analysis to the 8th century, 300 years before the Book of the Dun Cow was written. And even that 8th century language preserved older material. Scholars have found references to Cú Chulainn in poems dated to the 7th century, which means the tales were already ancient, already embedded in Irish culture, when someone finally decided to commit them to writing. So we must ask, how old are these stories really? The answer is that we do not know. Oral tradition can preserve material for centuries, even millennia, with remarkable fidelity. The tales may have originated anywhere from the Iron Age, perhaps the 4th or 3rd century before Christ, to the early medieval period. But all we can say with certainty is this. By the time Irish monks picked up their pens in the early medieval period, Cú Chulainn was already a legend of the distant past. The stories would continue to be copied and recopied over the following centuries. By around 1160, another great manuscript was completed, the Book of Leinster, held today at Trinity College, Dublin. This version of the Táin is longer, more complete, and written in a more literary style than the older Book of the Dun Cow. Later, in the late 14th century, scribes associated with Lacan and County Sligo produced another version, recorded in the Yellow Book of Lacan, still housed in Trinity College. Each manuscript tells the tale differently. Each adds details, omits passages, corrects what earlier scribes had written. By the time we reach the modern era, scholars have to decide which version is most authentic, and the honest answer is there may not be one true version at all. Cú Chulainn belonged to Ulster, the northern province of Ireland. In the stories, he served King Conchobar mac Nessa at the royal seat of Emain Macha, near what is today the city of Armagh. The tales are set in the 1st century, around the time of Christ, according to the chronology of the texts themselves, though scholars believe the actual customs and culture depicted reflect the Iron Age several centuries earlier. The stories were told in a society of warriors, of honor codes, of single combat and elaborate feasting. Cú Chulainn's greatest enemy was Queen Meb of Connaught, a figure who appears throughout the tales as intelligent, ambitious, and merciless. His closest friend was a warrior named Ferdiad, with whom he shared an intimate bond, so intimate that later scribes felt compelled to add gloss notes to the manuscript, as if uncomfortable with the affection described between the two men. These were not tales told in isolation. They formed part of what scholars call the Ulster cycle, a collection of about 80 sagas, poems, and shorter texts, all centered on the adventures of King Conchobar and the warriors of Ulster. The Cú Chulainn stories were the crown jewels of this cycle. His tale grew so prominent that the very identity of Ireland became entangled with his legend. And that is a theme we will return to, because it tells us something profound about how myths function in human consciousness. But first, we need to understand where Cú Chulainn came from, and that begins with a birth story unlike any other. Cú Chulainn was born with 2 different fathers and 3 separate conceptions. This is not an exaggeration. It is the literal narrative of the oldest Irish sources, and it reveals something essential about how medieval scribes understood divinity, mortality, and parentage in a Christian context. His birth name was Setanta. According to the most well-known version of his conception, recorded in the Comport Con Cúailnge, or the Conception of Cú Chulainn, preserved in the Book of the Dun Cow, the story begins with a royal hunt. King Conchobar and his nobles pursue a flock of magical birds across the landscape. A snowstorm forces them to seek shelter in a nearby house. Inside, the host's wife goes into labor and gives birth to a baby boy. A mare, in the same moment, gives birth to twin colts. When the Ulstermen wake the next morning, they discover something impossible. They are no longer sheltered in a house. They stand at Brunabuan, the sacred mound of Newgrange, a massive Neolithic monument built more than 4,000 years before this story was told. The house, the host, everyone has vanished. But the boy and the colts remain. Deichtine, the daughter and charioteer of King Conchobar, brought the boy home and began raising him. She falls into despair when the child becomes ill and dies. But then the god Lugh appears to her in a dream. He tells her he was the host that night, the man she sheltered with. He tells her he has placed his child in her womb, and the boy is to be called Setanta. The twin colts are to be reared as his horses. Now comes the scandal. Deichtine was already betrothed to a mortal man named Sualtam mac Roich. The Ulstermen suspect that a drunken King Conchobar is the father of her unborn child. To avoid shame, Deichtine goes to her bed and, the text tells us plainly, beats and crushes her own belly until she is virgin whole again. She induces a miscarriage of Lugh's child. She then marries Sualtam and conceives one more time. This 3rd child, born of a mortal father, is Cú Chulainn. Some scholars have proposed a fascinating interpretation of this triple conception. According to medieval Irish Christian theology, the Christian God required only one miraculous conception to create the incarnate Christ. The pagan god Lugh, by contrast, required 3 attempts and the aid of a mortal man to accomplish the same feat. The narrative in this reading subtly asserts Christian theological superiority. One divine conception is enough for Christ. Pagan gods need multiple attempts. But there is an earlier version of this story that does not include the triple conception at all. In this version, recorded in what scholars believe is an older stratum of the tales, Deichtine simply runs away with Lugh and bears him a child. The story is simpler, more straightforward, with less theological baggage. This variant reminds us that texts do not simply preserve ancient material unchanged. They reflect the concerns of the people who wrote them down. Medieval monks altered, expanded, and Christianized pagan material as they committed it to writing. At the age of 7, something happened that would shape the entire trajectory of Cú Chulainn's life. The boy, still called Setanta at this point, came to the playing field at Emain Masha to join the other children in games of hurling. He did not ask for permission to join, did not follow the custom of requesting the boy's protection. The other children saw this as a challenge. They attacked him, and Setanta had his first riastrad, his first warp spasm, his first battle frenzy. His body transformed. He beat all the boys single-handedly, and they scattered in terror. King Conchobar was so impressed by Setanta's prowess that he invited the boy to a feast at the house of Cúlainn, a master smith. Setanta promised to come, but first he wanted to finish his game. By the time he arrived at Cúlainn's house, darkness had fallen. Cúlainn, not knowing the boy was coming, had released his guard dog, a massive, ferocious hound, to protect his home. When Setanta approached, the dog attacked him, and Setanta, in self-defense, smashed the dog against a standing stone and killed it. Some versions say he drove a hurling ball down its throat with his stick. Cúlainn was devastated. The hound had been invaluable to him, a creature of supernatural power and strength. But young Setanta made him an offer. He would rear a replacement hound for Cúlainn, and in the meantime, he himself would serve as Cúlainn's guard, defending his house and possessions. The druid Cathbad, witnessing this act of honor and restitution, pronounced a new name upon the boy, Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Cúlainn. The boy who had killed a hound would now take its place. In a different part of the tale, another prophecy was being spoken. One day, Cú Chulainn overheard the druid Cathbad teaching his pupils. A student asked what day was auspicious for taking up arms. Cathbad replied that any warrior who took arms that day would achieve everlasting fame. The 7-year-old Cú Chulainn went at once to King Conchobar and demanded arms. Conchobar gave him weapons, but Cathbad had not finished his prophecy. The warrior who took arms that day would indeed be famous, but his life would be short. Cú Chulainn would never live to old age. He would burn brightly and then be extinguished. This is the first of the geis, the magical taboos and bindings that would constrain Cú Chulainn throughout his life. The boy could not escape it. It was spoken, and in Irish culture, the spoken word, especially a magical word pronounced by a druid, carried binding force. As a young man, Cú Chulainn became so remarkably beautiful that the Ulstermen worried he would seduce their wives and ruin their daughters. They determined that he must marry, and they searched all of Ireland for a suitable wife. Only one would do, Emer, daughter of Forgal Monarch. But her father was opposed to the match. Forgal suggested a solution, a death trap, really. He told Cú Chulainn that if he wished to win Emer's hand, he should first travel to the land of Alba, modern-day Scotland, and train in the martial arts with Scathach, a legendary warrior woman. Forgal hoped the ordeal would kill the boy. Instead, it transformed him. Cú Chulainn journeyed to the Isle of Skye and found Scathach at her fortress, Dunscaith, the Fortress of Shadows. She taught him all the arts of war. She taught him how to fight from a chariot, how to leap between chariot poles, how to balance on a spear butt with a single foot. Most importantly, she gave him the Gai Bulg, a terrible barbed spear that had to be thrown with the foot, not the hand, and expanded with spines once inside the victim's body. The wound from the Gai Bulg could not be healed. While training there, Cú Chulainn fell in love with Aoife, a rival warrior and, in some versions, Scathach's twin sister. Scathach knew Cú Chulainn could not defeat Aoife fairly. She was too skilled. So she gave him a powerful sleeping draught, but Cú Chulainn's strength was so great that the potion only put him to sleep for an hour. He woke, entered the battle, and fought Aoife to a standstill. Then he did something cruel and clever. He cried out that her horses and chariot, the things she valued most in the world, had fallen from a cliff. In her moment of distraction, he overpowered her. He held a sword to her throat and made her promise to end her feud with Scathach. In exchange, he would spare her life. But he also demanded something else, that she bear him a son. That son, named Conla in the texts, would become one of the most tragic figures in Irish mythology, but that is a story for another time. Cú Chulainn returned from Scotland fully trained, a warrior without equal. He abducted Emer, defeated her father in combat, and won her as his wife. And for a time, he was happy. But happiness was never destined to be his permanent state. A stronger fate was already closing in. At the age of 17, everything changed. Queen Medb of Connaught, ambitious and cunning, had her eye on a magnificent stud bull. The bull belonged to Ulster, to King Conchobar's people. Medb gathered a vast army, the combined forces of 3 provinces, and marched north to steal the beast and assert her dominance over Ulster. But there was a problem. The men of Ulster had been cursed. According to legend, a goddess had punished them for a slight, and during this exact time of year, all the men of fighting age would suffer from the pains of childbirth, rendered helpless and weak. Every warrior in Ulster lay incapacitated. Every warrior except one, Cú Chulainn. Sources don't give a clear reason for this exception, ranging from his semi-god status to inventing some rationales later. The young warrior stepped forward and invoked the ancient rite of single combat. He would face Medb's army, one champion at a time, at the fords of Ulster. As long as he won those combats, the army could not advance. And so Cú Chulainn stood alone. For months, he fought. Champion after champion came to face him, and Cú Chulainn defeated them all. But during one of these combats, the Morrigan, the goddess of fate, war, and sovereignty, came to him, claiming to be the daughter of a king, and offers him her love, but he refuses her. In revenge, she attacked him while he fought. As an eel, she tripped him in the ford, and he broke her ribs. As a wolf, she stampeded cattle toward him, and he blinded her eye with a sling stone. As a heifer, she charged at him at the head of a stampede, and he broke her leg. Fight with the invading army carried on. After one of the battles, Cú Chulainn was severely wounded. His father, the god Lugh, came to him in a vision and healed his wounds. When Cú Chulainn woke, he discovered something terrible. The boy troop of Emain Macha, the young warriors he had trained with, whom he loved like brothers, had attacked the Connaught army in an attempt to help him, and they had all been slaughtered. The text describes what happened next in language so vivid and grotesque that medieval scribes felt compelled to add editorial notes. This is the moment of Cú Chulainn's most spectacular riastrad. The first warp spasm seized Cú Chulainn and made him into a monstrous thing, hideous and shapeless, unheard of. His shanks and his joints, every knuckle and angle and organ from head to foot, shook like a tree in the flood or a reed in the stream. His body made a furious twist inside his skin so that his feet and shins switched to the rear and his heels and calves switched to the front. The description goes on. His eye sinks into his skull so deep that a crane could not reach it. His mouth distorts hideously. His organs flap from his throat. The hair on his head stands up like a thorn bush, so rigid that if apples were shaken above him, each one would spike upon a hair rather than fall to the ground. In this state, neither friend nor foe were safe. Cú Chulainn attacked the Connaught army and killed hundreds of them, building walls of corpses. He was a force of nature, barely controllable, barely human. This moment, the riastrad, is central to understanding Cú Chulainn. It is not merely a metaphor for anger. It is a literal transformation of body and mind, and it is both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. When the frenzy takes him, he cannot distinguish friend from foe. He becomes a weapon that cannot be aimed. He becomes a problem for the very people he is trying to protect. The war dragged on. Cú Chulainn continued to meet champions at the fords. But one day, a warrior came to face him, whose name made Cú Chulainn's heart break before the combat even began. It was Ferdiad, his beloved friend, his foster brother, the man he had trained with alongside the warrior woman Scathach. The text tells us that Cú Chulainn and Ferdiad had shared a bed, had spoken at great length of their love for one another. They had been closer than brothers, and now they stood opposite each other, spears ready, and they began to fight. They fought for 3 days and 3 nights. During that time, they called truces each evening and embraced. Cú Chulainn would give Ferdiad healing herbs for his wounds, but when morning came, they would take up arms again. On the 3rd day, after a long and brutal combat, both of them were exhausted and wounded nearly to death. And then Cú Chulainn felt the riastrad beginning to take him. His body began to transform. In that state of superhuman rage and strength, he called for the gaibog, the terrible barbed spear that Scathach had taught him to wield. He threw it with his foot, It entered Ferdiad's body and expanded with its spines. Ferdiad fell into the ford. As he died, he looked at his friend and spoke words that have echoed through Irish literature for 1,000 years. We would have carried the flag of Ulster to the gates of Rome and beyond Cú Chulainn. We would have done great deeds together. Cú Chulainn was grief-stricken. He keened and mourned his friend. And in that moment, we see the tragic flaw that runs through this entire legend. Cú Chulainn's strength is inseparable from his lack of control. The Riastrad that saved Ulster also killed the man he loved most. The Ulster cycle stories existed first in the minds and memories of bards and storytellers. They were performed, heard, not read. The oldest manuscripts preserve fragments of verse that would have been inserted into the prose narrative, verses that we know were composed by individual bards to ornament the basic story. Every bard would have told the tale differently, emphasizing different episodes, adding their own flourishes, altering the moral weight of certain scenes. These were stories told in a society of warriors, told to warriors. They answered certain questions that people had about the nature of power, honor, and fate. In a world where physical strength determined survival, where single combat was the way disputes were settled, Cú Chulainn represented an ideal, the warrior perfect in his skill, fearless in the face of death, loyal to his lord and his companions. But the stories also troubled this ideal. Because Cú Chulainn's strength was not a blessing, it was a curse. The prophecy spoken over him at age 7 ensured that he would never know peace. His Riastrad was not something he could control or turn off at will. It was something that possessed him, that made him dangerous to everyone around him, even to those he loved. The ancient Irish understood something that modern audiences sometimes miss. The greatest warriors are not always the greatest heroes. Sometimes the greatest warriors are wounded, traumatized, isolated by their own power. Cú Chulainn embodies this tragic insight. He saved Ulster single-handedly, and his victory cost him everything. His dearest friend, his peace of mind, ultimately, his life. Scholars have noted striking parallels between Cú Chulainn and other Indo-European heroes. The Persian hero Rostam also killed his own son in single combat, not recognizing him. The Germanic Hildebrand's Lied tells a similar story. The Greek hero Heracles was driven mad and forced to perform impossible labors as punishment for a crime he committed in his madness. What emerges across these tales is a pattern. The hero's greatest strength generates his greatest vulnerability. Power corrupts. Isolation corrodes the soul. And sometimes the man who saves his people does so by sacrificing his own humanity. But before we reach that final sacrifice, we must address a curious fact about Cú Chulainn's death. The sources tell us he died breaking a geas, a magical taboo. In Irish culture, certain actions were forbidden to certain people. These prohibitions were taken with absolute seriousness. They were binding, inviolable, and if you broke a geas, the consequences were catastrophic. Cú Chulainn had many guys upon him. One of them was a prohibition against eating dog meat. Now, at the end of his life, when Mebi wanted to draw him out to his death, she conspired with his enemies. They wanted to weaken him spiritually before the final combat. An old woman came to him, offering him food. She was cooking a meal of dog meat. Now, in ancient Irish society, there was also a powerful general taboo. You could not refuse hospitality. If someone offered you food or shelter, you had to accept. Cú Chulainn faced an impossible choice. He could not accept the food because of his geas. He could not refuse it because of the hospitality taboo. He made his choice. He ate the dog meat, and the moment he did, he felt something shift inside himself. He was spiritually weakened. The magic that had protected him all his life had been broken from within. Lugard, the son of one of Cú Chulainn's enemies, had 3 magical spears forged. A prophecy said that a king would fall by each of them. With the first, Lugard killed Cú Chulainn's charioteer Leg, king of chariot drivers, the only man in the world who had been with him since childhood. With the second, he killed Laith Macha, king of horses, Cú Chulainn's horse, a creature as noble and loyal as his master. With the third, he struck Cú Chulainn himself, mortally wounding him. And now comes the final act. Cú Chulainn knew he was dying, but he refused to fall to the ground. He stumbled to a nearby standing stone, a rock that would stand upright, and he bound himself to it with his own belt, tying himself so that he would remain upright even as death took him. He wanted to face his enemies on his feet to the very end. The Connaught warriors circled him, but they could not believe he was dead. His body remained rigid, tied to the stone. His eyes still blazed with defiance. His sword still hung in his hand. They waited for a sign of true death. And then a raven landed on his shoulder. Only then did they approach. Lugard came forward to claim victory, to take the head of the greatest warrior who had ever lived. As he drew his sword to cut off Cú Chulainn's head, something miraculous and terrible happened. A light, a hero's light, a blazing radiance erupted from Cú Chulainn's body. His sword fell from his dead hand and severed Lugard's own hand, leaving it hanging by a thread of skin. The light persisted, burning around the corpse, until finally Cú Chulainn's right arm, his sword arm, was cut off, and only then did the light fade. Even in death, he would not grant his enemies a clean victory. Now here is where we must address a common misconception about Cú Chulainn. Many people believe he was an incarnation of the god Lugh, that is, that Lugh took human form to walk the earth as this warrior. This understanding is widespread in popular retellings and modern adaptations. The original texts, however, do not support this reading. Cú Chulainn is the son of Lugh, not an incarnation of Lugh. This distinction matters profoundly. As an incarnation, Cú Chulainn would be divine, essentially immortal, only pretending to be mortal. But the texts establish him as genuinely mortal, genuinely vulnerable, even though he has a divine father. This confusion likely arose from Lady Gregory's famous 1902 retelling, Cú Chulainn of Morthemne. Gregory was a crucial figure in the Irish literary revival, an effort to reclaim and celebrate Irish culture in the face of colonial suppression. But she explicitly romanticized the original tales, paraphrasing rather than translating directly, omitting the most violent and explicit content, and adding emotional and narrative flourishes of her own. Her version was so widely read and so beloved that it shaped how millions of English speakers understood Irish mythology. The original medieval texts are far more complex, far more ambiguous, and far more violent than Gregory's version. The medieval scribes who wrote them down were Christian monks, living centuries after the tales originated in pagan oral tradition. These monks altered the material, added Christian theological commentary, corrected what they saw as errors or inconsistencies. No single authentic version exists. We have only layers, pagan, Christian, scribal, folkloric, all compressed into the manuscripts we hold today. In the modern era, Cú Chulainn has been adapted, reinterpreted, and appropriated countless times. He appears in contemporary fiction, video games, comic books, and academic analyses. Some of these retellings are faithful to the spirit of the original tales. Others strip away the complexity and the tragedy in favor of a simpler narrative of heroic triumph. One of the most famous adaptations is the work of William Butler Yeats, who wrote multiple plays and poems about Cú Chulainn between 1904 and 1939. Yeats used the legend to explore themes of honor, sacrifice, and the clash between heroic ideals and the messiness of human reality. His plays, On Bailey's Strand, The Green Helmet, At the Hawk's Well, The Only Jealousy of Emer, and The Death of Cú Chulainn, remain performed today. But Yeats, like Gregory, took liberties with the source material. He shaped the legend to serve his artistic vision, and that is not necessarily a criticism. That is what artists do. They take old material and make it speak to their own time. The question is whether the retelling illuminates the original or obscures it. Perhaps nowhere is the contested nature of Cú Chulainn's legacy more evident than in the fate of a single bronze sculpture. In 1911 and 1912, an Irish sculptor named Oliver Shepherd created a statue titled The Death of Cú Chulainn. It depicts the dying warrior tied to a stone, his body slumping from exhaustion and blood loss, his head bowed. The pose evokes Michelangelo's Pieta, the image of Mary holding her dead son. The warrior is nearly naked, wearing only a headband and a loincloth, his sword and shield lowered, rendered almost vulnerable by his proximity to death. Shepherd exhibited the statue at the Royal Hibernian Academy in 1914, years before anyone could have foreseen its symbolic power. But in 1916, Irish Republicans rose up in rebellion against British rule. The Easter Rising failed militarily, but the executions that followed transformed it into a defining moment in Irish nationalist consciousness. In 1935, more than 2 decades after the rebellion, the Irish Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, had Shepherd's statue installed in the General Post Office in Dublin, the very building where the Rising had been headquartered. De Valera chose this image deliberately to link the mythical past with the revolutionary present. Patrick Pearse, one of the leaders of the Rising, had famously spoken of Cú Chulainn as embodying a true type of Gaelic nationality, full as it is of youthful life and vigor and hope. The statue became the visual symbol of Irish independence and sacrifice. It appeared on military medals, on commemorative coins, in nationalist murals throughout Dublin and the Irish countryside. The dying hero became a metaphor for the nation's struggle and willingness to die for freedom. But here is the crucial complication. As the decades passed, this image was claimed and reclaimed by different groups. In the north of Ireland, where the conflict between British Unionists and Irish Republicans continued long after independence, both sides invoked Cú Chulainn. Nationalists used the statue to symbolize their struggle, but loyalists also claimed him, reinterpreting him as the defender of Ulster against enemies from the south, using Ian Adamson's controversial theory that Cú Chulainn was actually a pre-Celtic Cruithan hero, not an Irish one at all. The legend, in other words, has become a battleground. Different communities project their own struggles onto Cú Chulainn's image. He has become a symbol that can mean almost anything, depending on who is looking at him. And that tells us something profound. This legend endures, not because it is unchanging, but because it is capacious. It has room enough for contradictory meanings. It speaks to something deep in the human experience of loyalty, sacrifice, and defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. We live in an era of complex heroes. The days of simple, unambiguous heroism have largely passed in our cultural imagination. We are drawn to characters who are flawed, traumatized, morally ambiguous, caught between impossible choices. In this context, Cú Chulainn feels remarkably modern. He is, at heart, a study in the psychological cost of warfare. He is brilliant and skilled, but the very gifts that make him great, his strength, his rage, his inability to stop himself once he begins, are also the sources of his torment. He kills his dearest friend. He breaks a taboo not out of carelessness or rebellion, but out of the impossible bind of conflicting duties, and he dies not in a glorious triumph, but in a slow bleeding out tied to a stone, his enemies circling him, waiting for death to confirm what they see before them. This is not a hero's tale in the modern sense. It is a tragedy. And tragedies, we know, have a power that simple victory narratives do not. They speak to something true about the human condition, the way that our greatest qualities can become our greatest liabilities, the way that duty and honor can lead us toward our own destruction. Furthermore, the legend raises questions about power itself. A society that depends on a single warrior, who is superhuman, who cannot be controlled, who becomes dangerous when activated, is a society in a precarious position. What happens when that warrior can no longer be contained? What happens when the person who is supposed to protect you becomes, in his transformed state, a threat to you as well? These are not merely ancient concerns. They are deeply contemporary. We live in an age of weapons that cannot be unseen, technologies that cannot be unbuilt, powers that cannot be fully controlled by the people who wield them. Cú Chulainn understands this dilemma from within. He is the living embodiment of this problem. Over these past 30 minutes, we have traced the legend of Cú Chulainn from its earliest written sources in the 12th century, through its various manuscript versions, and into the modern era, where it has become a symbol claimed by competing political movements. We have met a young warrior, born of a god and a mortal, cursed to glory and an early death. We have watched him grow into the greatest defender Ulster has ever known, only to discover that his greatest gift, his riastrad, his ability to transform into an unstoppable force, is also his greatest curse. We have seen him kill his dearest friend in combat, and we have witnessed his final stand, tied to a standing stone, refusing to fall even as death claims him. We have learned that this story exists in multiple versions, written by different scribes across different centuries, each reflecting the concerns and theology of the person who copied it. We have discovered that popular modern retellings, like Lady Gregory's romantic 1902 version, often differ significantly from the violent, complex original medieval texts. And we have seen how a single image, a bronze statue by Oliver Shepherd, has become a contested symbol, meaning different things to different communities seeking to claim the legacy of this ancient hero. What emerges from all of this is a legend that endures not because it provides easy answers, but because it asks hard questions. Questions about loyalty, about the cost of strength, about the way that honor and taboo can bind us to our own destruction. And because those questions are timeless, this story, this old, violent, tragic story from medieval Ireland, still speaks to us today. Thank you for joining me for this journey into the legend of Cú Chulainn. If you enjoyed exploring this myth, please consider following the podcast, leaving a review on your favorite podcast app, and sharing this episode with someone who loves mythology, history, or great storytelling. Next time on Beat Nomads, History and Myths Awakened, we continue to look at the legends of Emerald Isle. The following legend will be about Deirdre, a heroine in Ulster cycle, also known as Deirdre of the Sorrows. Join us to hear this tragic tale. Until then, keep listening to the legends that shaped us.